Nathaniel Allen, who tragically passed away, fathered your son, Nicorian, because, say, Ms. Willingham is trying to pin this child on your deceased son.
So as far as depending on the system, I don't know where they're getting that from. I barely call them and ask them for anything. You know, Nathaniel is the father of Nicorian, so they can know, you know.
You have to go and help me. Y'all need to help me. And I said, what do I need to do? So she took me to the Social Security office, and they told her she had to get letters.
You say you just don't believe
No.
this is his biological child. You don't believe this is your grandson.
No.
Did you write the letter?
Yes, I did.
Did you bring that letter to court today?
No, I did not.
I have the letter.
So that you could potentially collect death benefits for your child, whom you say is Nathaniel Allen's biological child.
This description captures a single extended case in Judge Lauren Lake's courtroom where questions of paternity, responsibility, and trust collide. The courtroom atmosphere is tense from the very beginning because everyone understands that this is not only about a DNA test, but also about the deeper relationship between law and justice. People who walk into this courtroom often think they are prepared for answers, but many soon regret taking a DNA test because the truth they demanded becomes a permanent record, one that cannot be undone. In today's session, Judge Lauren Lake presides over a complicated paternity dispute that connects emotional testimonies, unresolved resentment, legal principles, and important evidence. The parties enter the room carrying old arguments, new accusations, and years of misunderstanding. The mother, who arrives determined to present her truth, stands firm in her claim that she knows the identity of her child's father. She believes that this courtroom is the only place where her story will finally be heard without judgment. She insists she did not come for sympathy. She came for justice, for clarity, and for closure. Across from her stands the opposing family, people who have doubts, suspicions, and their own version of events. They believe the mother is using the situation in a way that is not fair, and that she is trying to benefit from the system. This accusation instantly raises the stakes. Judge Lauren Lake listens carefully, reminding both sides that her courtroom is not a place for personal attacks, but a place to uncover truth through lawful evidence. The tension becomes more visible when the case shifts into what Judge Lake calls the evidence stage in a divorce case, style conflict, even though the parties are not actually divorcing. The principles are the same. Personal relationships break down, narratives conflict, and each side attempts to prove their claim to the court. Here, testimonies are treated like evidence. Words are weighed with the seriousness of legal declarations. Judge Lake explains that the court must examine every detail carefully, because false assumptions can destroy families. The mother begins by describing the difficulties she has faced since the alleged father passed away. She explains that she has been raising her child alone and trying to provide everything without depending on anyone. She says she has no intention of misusing government benefits or deceiving anyone about paternity. According to her, the deceased father acknowledged the child privately, even if he had doubts at certain times. She claims that before his death, he discussed responsibilities and future planning, such as adding the child to his 401k plan. These details carry emotional weight because they show a relationship that was complicated but meaningful. The opposing family members, however, offer a different story. They insist that the deceased man had strong doubts about the paternity long before the child was born. They recall moments when he expressed suspicion, pointed out inconsistencies, and questioned the timeline of conception. They state confidently that their son or nephew believed the child was not biologically his. One family member even brings up moments when the deceased allegedly caught the mother in situations that fueled his distrust. The mother immediately disputes this, claiming those memories are exaggerated or misinterpreted. She insists that misunderstandings from past breakups are being used unfairly against her. At this point, Judge Lauren Lake brings the conversation back to the central issue. DNA is evidence, and without it, the court cannot rely solely on conflicting memories. She also points out that when people come into court seeking truth, they must accept that the truth may hurt. This courtroom is not about reputation, it is about facts. Because the alleged father is deceased, the court cannot use a regular paternity test. Instead, the case relies on grandparentage DNA analysis, a method often used when the biological father is not available. This advanced testing compares the child's DNA with the relatives of the alleged father to determine whether a genetic relationship exists. Judge Lake explains the process clearly so both sides understand the scientific foundation behind the test. She emphasizes that this type of test is recognized under the law and can serve as strong evidence. Before the DNA results are presented, the courtroom hears detailed testimonies from both sides. Family members describe their experiences, disagreements, and emotional turmoil. One aunt recalls the day the deceased father asked her to look at the newborn to see if the child resembled him. She explains how unsure he seemed, how conflicted he felt, and how much he wanted the truth. Another relative, who is called by phone, gives her own recollection. She states that the deceased man expressed serious doubt, but she personally believes the child resembles the family. These contrasting statements show the complexity of human perception. Judge Lake points out that resemblance is subjective and cannot be treated as evidence. She explains that relying on physical appearance alone is one of the most unreliable ways to determine biological connection. This helps transition the case toward the legal and scientific tools that the court must use. During the testimony, Judge Lake also references how cases like this often appear on legal podcasts such as Truth Changes Everything podcast, the Game Changing Attorney podcast, and the Divorce Course podcast, where experts discuss how evidence, law, and personal emotion collide in family disputes. She uses this moment to explain to the audience that courts must operate on facts rather than feelings. She even mentions that in some cases the law allows something called adverse inference, a principle under the Evidence Act where a court may assume that missing or withheld information might have worked against the person who failed to present it. Although not directly applied here, Judge Lake uses the concept to educate about how evidence functions in legal reasoning. The conversation becomes emotional when the mother describes how hard it has been raising her child alone while facing accusations from the deceased father's family. She insists that she never planned to deceive anyone, especially not the child's paternal relatives. She wants her child to know where they come from, to have family connections, and to grow up without the shadow of doubt. She says she came to court not for financial gain, but to bring an end to the painful questioning. In response, the paternal grandmother expresses both skepticism and concern. She explains that she initially wrote a letter to the Social Security office after the mother asked her to, but the letter included statements reflecting her son's doubts. This letter becomes an important part of the case because it demonstrates conflicting accounts. The mother felt the letter damaged her claim, while the grandmother believed she was simply telling the truth as she knew it. Judge Lauren Lake acknowledges that these misunderstandings often appear in families, especially in cases involving death, financial uncertainty, and mixed emotions. She reminds the courtroom that truth is not always clean or kind. Sometimes it is messy, painful, and complicated. The grandmother expresses that regardless of her doubts, she has still opened her home to the child and other grandchildren. She says she is willing to help, but she also believes the truth must be confirmed. This moment softens the atmosphere because it shows that beneath the tension, there is a desire to support the child, whether emotionally or legally. To further clarify issues regarding Social Security benefits, the court invites a financial expert who explains how children of deceased parents can qualify for benefits. She outlines the requirements, written declarations, tax documents, beneficiary designations, and legal acknowledgement. She confirms that DNA evidence plays a critical role when no other documentation exists. Her testimony highlights how real-life legal systems operate, blending technical rules with emotional realities. Throughout the hearing, Judge Lake maintains control with firmness and compassion. She listens to each person, reminds them to speak one at a time, and ensures that both sides understand the legal principles at work. She acknowledges how court cases like these often touch topics discussed in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, adoption stories full episodes, and even Supreme Court child support interpretations, because all of them explore how families fight for truth and resolution. After hours of testimony, questions, emotional statements, and legal explanation, Judge Lauren Lake signals that it is time for the DNA results. The room becomes silent instantly. Everyone knows the answer will change relationships forever. As Judge Lauren Lake prepares to open the sealed envelope, the courtroom becomes unusually quiet. Even the tension between the families seems to pause for a moment. Every person sitting in front of her knows that this DNA result is more than a scientific report. It is a defining moment that will shape identities, relationships, financial support, and even future emotional healing. Judge Lake reminds the courtroom that while many people fear what DNA might reveal, the truth is essential because truth changes everything. She often mentions this whenever she teaches about the relationship between law and justice, explaining that justice cannot exist without the honesty required to support it. Before she reads the results, Judge Lake carefully addresses both families again. She emphasizes that DNA testing is not meant to punish anyone or to assign shame. Instead, it is a neutral tool used by the court to uncover facts so the law can intervene fairly. She mentions that people often contact her courtroom after listening to powerful legal shows such as the Truth Changes Everything podcast, the Divorce Course podcast, or the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, hoping to understand how evidence works and what options they have in complicated domestic disputes. She explains that stories like these often reveal how important it is to separate emotional beliefs from legally reliable evidence. The grandmother sits on one side, nervous but composed. She represents the deceased father's family, carrying not just her own opinion but the memory of her son's doubts. On the other side, the mother wipes her eyes quietly, knowing that whatever Judge Lake says next could completely transform the course of her life. She has fought alone, struggled alone, and defended her truth repeatedly. She believes the DNA test will finally validate her claims, ending the accusations that she has been trying to manipulate the system. Judge Lake holds the envelope but continues with one final explanation, something she often shares to help both parties cope with whatever truth emerges. She reminds them that many people regret taking DNA tests, not because the results are wrong, but because the results force them to face a reality they avoided. She states that fear of truth can shape families, destroy relationships, or create opportunities for reconciliation, depending on how people respond. She discusses how adverse inference under the Evidence Act sometimes applies in cases where one side refuses to provide information. However, in this case, both parties cooperated fully. She acknowledges their willingness to participate despite emotional discomfort. Cooperation, she says, is the first step toward building a healthier future for the child involved. Finally, she opens the envelope. The sound of paper sliding open feels dramatic even without any scene description, because the entire case has been building toward this pivotal moment. She reads the scientific findings. The DNA of the alleged father could not be tested directly due to his death, but the DNA comparison between the child and the grandmother shows a strong biological connection. This establishes that the deceased man is indeed the biological father. At this moment, the mother closes her eyes, overwhelmed with a mixture of relief, vindication, and grief. Every day she spent defending herself now feels justified. She has waited for someone in a position of authority, someone like Judge Lauren Lake, to tell the world that she was telling the truth all along. The grandmother reacts emotionally as well. Her reaction is a blend of surprise, acceptance, and something softer, perhaps regret for doubting the child's biological connection. Judge Lake explains the result in clear legal terms. She states that the DNA findings remove all doubt under the law and that the child is officially recognized as belonging to the deceased father's bloodline. This means Social Security benefits, inheritance rights, family history, and legal identity can finally align. She clarifies that this outcome does not punish the family who doubted, because doubt is natural when communication breaks down. She emphasizes that the court never blames people for wanting proof. It only ensures that proof is achieved fairly. Once the shock begins to settle, the courtroom moves into the emotional reflection stage, something Judge Lake always encourages. She urges both sides to consider the child as their central responsibility, not their past conflicts. She talks about how families often heal after truth emerges, using examples similar to those shared in Celebrate Recovery testimonies. These testimonies show how confronting uncomfortable truths leads to recovery, unity, and emotional freedom. Judge Lake believes family healing begins with transparency. The grandmother admits that now she wishes she had been more open-hearted and less suspicious. She expresses a desire to build a better relationship with both the mother and the child. She even shares how much she regrets that her son never lived to see the confirmation that the child was his. Her emotional honesty impresses the court because it shows that even painful situations can evolve into opportunities for reconnection. The mother then speaks from her own perspective. She says she understands why the family doubted but wishes they had shown her more support in the beginning. She describes how difficult it was living with the label of dishonesty when she knew the truth. She explains that she had no motivation to lie, especially knowing how complicated the process of proving paternity can be. She admits that while she is relieved, she also feels sadness for the years lost in conflict. Judge Lake listens carefully and uses this moment to explain that the legal system is designed to protect children, not to determine who is right in emotional disputes. She emphasizes that the purpose of the courtroom is to provide clarity through verified evidence, thereby preventing long-term damage to families. She often teaches this idea through references to topics found in adoption stories, full episodes, and Supreme Court child support cases. These examples help families understand that the court's goal is fairness, stability, and the child's best interest. After a deep breath, Judge Lake shifts the conversation to practical steps. She advises the grandmother and mother to communicate more constructively in the future, especially regarding the child's upbringing. She explains that now that the biological connection is confirmed, the child deserves access to both sides of the family. Judge Lake encourages them to build a healthier environment rather than dwell on old conflict. She warns them that children sense emotional tension even when they cannot understand it, and unresolved negativity can cause long-term emotional harm. She explains that the grandmother must now accept full responsibility for acknowledging her grandchild publicly and privately. Judge Lake mentions that the initial doubts were understandable, but should no longer dictate their behavior. She instructs the family to create new plans for visitation, emotional support, and financial obligations, always guided by law, evidence, and the best interest of the child. The mother is encouraged to allow the paternal family to be involved, now that paternity is officially confirmed. Judge Lake emphasizes that family involvement is beneficial as long as it is healthy, respectful, and centered on the child's well-being. She reminds them that paternity confirmation is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new chapter where family unity becomes possible. During her closing message, Judge Lake once again connects the case to broader principles discussed in legal education, jurisprudence, and modern courtroom analysis. She talks about the concept of justice in jurisprudence, highlighting that justice is not simply about winners and losers. Justice is about restoring balance, offering protection, resolving disputes, and giving people the tools to move forward. She explains that today's case demonstrates how law can act as a guide when human emotions make situations confusing. She then reminds everyone in the courtroom that truth, no matter how difficult, is always better than uncertainty. She mentions that many people who hesitate to take a DNA test eventually realize that concealment or avoidance only deepens emotional wounds. She explains that today's truth will allow the child to grow up with identity, belonging, and stability. As court comes to a close, the emotional tone softens. The grandmother offers to be more present in the child's life. The mother cautiously accepts, understanding that cooperation is now possible. Judge Lake concludes with a final message that echoes across every case she handles. Evidence brings clarity, clarity brings peace, and peace creates the foundation that every child deserves. This second section ends with the courtroom transitioning from conflict toward healing, one truth at a time. After the DNA results are confirmed, and Judge Lauren Lake has guided both families toward acceptance, the courtroom enters a quieter, more reflective stage. Although the legal question has been resolved, the emotional weight of the case is still settling. Judge Lake is aware that while the test can answer biological questions, it cannot mend hearts instantly. She uses the remaining time to shift the conversation away from conflict and toward long-term healing. Judge Lake begins by addressing the mother directly. She acknowledges the courage it took for her to step into court, especially when facing accusations, suspicions, and misunderstandings. She explains that many people in similar situations fear bringing their cases forward because they worry about judgment. However, the legal system exists precisely for moments like this, to create clarity and protect children from growing up surrounded by doubt. Judge Lake mentions that her courtroom, much like the stories featured in recovery-oriented programs and Celebrate Recovery testimonies, witnesses many families dealing with shame, broken trust, and complicated histories. She emphasizes that healing always begins with truth, and today's truth will slowly reshape every relationship connected to this child. The mother nods, wiping quiet tears as she listens. She expresses relief that the burden she has carried for years is finally lifted, relief not only for herself but for her child, who will one day learn about this moment. She knows that identity matters deeply. Children grow up seeking answers about who they are, where they come from, and how they fit into the world. Now that the DNA test has confirmed paternity, her child will not have to grow up with unanswered questions, or with the emotional scars that uncertainty often causes. Judge Lauren Lake turns to the grandmother next. She thanks her for being honest about the doubts she held and for sharing the memories of her deceased son. She acknowledges that grief can complicate perception, and when a loved one dies, families often hold onto their words, fears, and beliefs, even when they may not be fully accurate. She makes it clear that no one is being blamed for struggling with uncertainty. She also reminds the grandmother that now that truth has been revealed, it becomes her responsibility to act with fairness, compassion, and willingness to rebuild family unity. The grandmother expresses something she had not said earlier, that her doubts were rooted not in anger, but in fear. Fear of being emotionally attached to a child who might not share her bloodline. She admits that after losing her son, she was terrified to love again, terrified of heartbreak, and afraid of investing emotionally in a relationship she was not sure was real. Judge Lake listens empathetically and explains that this kind of emotional conflict is common, especially when dealing with death, memory, and unresolved issues. She says that paternity cases often reveal how human vulnerability and legal evidence intersect. Now that the test has confirmed the child's biological relationship to the deceased father, Judge Lake encourages the grandmother to embrace her role fully. She tells her that love is more powerful than fear, and that children benefit when extended families work together instead of falling apart. She also warns both sides not to let old arguments define their future interactions. She emphasizes that the ultimate goal of the courtroom is always the same: to protect the child's well-being. Everything else, hurt feelings, misunderstandings, accusations, must now take a back seat to the child's needs. Next, Judge Lake discusses the legal implications of the result. She explains that because the DNA test has legally confirmed biological connection, the mother now has stronger grounds for securing benefits, identity records, and future legal protections for her child. She mentions that this aligns with legal frameworks discussed in many influential legal programs, including the Game-Changing Attorney podcast and the Divorce Course podcast, where experts discuss how DNA results shape both courtroom decisions and family responsibilities. Judge Lake uses this as a teaching moment, demonstrating how legal principles apply to real lives. She also revisits the earlier discussion about the adverse inference concept in evidence law. She clarifies that while the court did not need to rely on adverse inference in this case, understanding it helps families realize how important factual cooperation is in legal matters. The grandmother's willingness to engage in testing and to participate honestly helped the court reach a scientifically reliable conclusion. This cooperation ensured that the final decision is strong, defensible, and fair under the law. Judge Lake then broadens the conversation to talk about the concept of justice in jurisprudence. She reminds everyone that justice is not simply the blind application of rules. It is the thoughtful balancing of truth, fairness, and the long-term well-being of everyone involved. True justice requires humility,